William and Anne have been quietly working against Camilla for 3 years, and the woman who walked into Westminster Abbey wearing the late Queen's tiara, the woman who was supposed to represent the final chapter of the most controversial royal story in living memory, has just made a move that tells you everything about where she thinks this ends. She transferred Ray Mill House out of her personal name, quietly, with no announcement and no public statement. The private Wiltshire retreat she had owned since before she ever became Queen Consort, the place she described publicly as the best therapy in the world, is no longer registered in her name. And then, almost simultaneously, Charles bought the property next door. If you have been following this family closely, you already know that nothing that happens quietly inside that institution is actually quiet. There is always a pattern, and this one, once you see the full picture of what has been building around Camilla since the coronation in May 2023, is one of the most significant signals this family has sent in a very long time. This is the story of how Camilla went from standing in Westminster Abbey with the late Queen's tiara on her head to quietly moving her private property out of her name, while the two most powerful people working against her, Princess Anne and Prince William, have been dismantling everything she built, one silent decision at a time. Stay with me, the backstory here genuinely matters. Most people know the basic outline of what happened between Charles, Diana, and Camilla. The affair, the tapes, the confessions, the panorama interview, the divorce, and then the crash in Paris in August 1997. Diana was 36 years old, her sons were 15 and 12. That outline is accurate as far as it goes, but it leaves out almost everything that explains what is happening right now inside Buckingham Palace. Camilla did not disappear when Diana died. She stayed close to Charles. She married him in April 2005 at Windsor Guildhall, and then in May 2023, nearly 2 decades after that registry office ceremony, she walked into Westminster Abbey at the coronation wearing the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, Queen Elizabeth's personal favorite piece of jewelry for decades. That moment was supposed to be the final word. The rehabilitation was complete. The public had largely moved on. The institution had formally accepted her. But there was one person watching that coronation who never considered it anything close to the final word. And that person had been watching Camilla for a very long time, longer than most people realize. Princess Anne has been a working member of this royal family for over 70 years. She watched the Camillagate tapes come out in 1993. She watched Charles sit down with Jonathan Dimbleby in 1994 and confess the affair on national television. She watched the divorce in 1996, and then she watched Diana die in that Paris tunnel, while the institution she had served her entire life debated for 4 full days whether to lower its flags. Anne does not do public emotion. She never has. The people closest to her will tell you she processes things differently from most of the family. She files information, she observes patterns, she waits. Sources say something shifted in Anne after the coronation. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more deliberate than anger. Something that looked to the people who know her well like a decision being made and stored away until the right moment arrived. That moment apparently came in February of last year. A senior palace aide made a phone call. It lasted 9 minutes. It was about Camilla, and according to sources, the direction of several things changed before that call was finished.
Now, before we go any further, I want to be straight with you about something. A significant amount of what circulates around royal sources gets repeated until it sounds more certain than it actually is. The palace does not confirm these conversations. It never will. That is simply how this institution has always operated. What we can look at is the visible, documented pattern of what has actually happened over the past 3 years, and that pattern on its own tells a very specific story. But here is the thing you cannot understand without knowing a piece of history that most coverage skips entirely. Back in the early 1970s, before any of the Charles and Diana chapter had even begun, Princess Anne was involved with a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles. Their romance reportedly began around Ascot Week in June 1970. The British press wrote about it. It was a documented relationship, not a rumor. The reason it could never go further was straightforward. Andrew Parker Bowles was Catholic, and Anne, then fourth in line to the throne, was bound to the Church of England. Marriage was simply not possible. And the man Anne was involved with was the man Camilla eventually married in 1973. There's a detail from biographer Penny Junor that makes the geometry of all this even more tangled. According to Junor, when Andrew Parker Bowles was seeing Anne, Camilla, who had previously been involved with Andrew herself, started spending time with Charles, partly out of frustration at being set aside. As one source put it at the time, Princess Anne was in love with Parker Bowles, Camilla was in love with Andrew, Charles was in love with Camilla. All of them were circling each other. Anne has carried that piece of personal history for 50 years, not as public heartbreak. The people close to her describe it not as something that wounds her, but as information, specific personal information about exactly what kind of woman Camilla is and how long she has been comfortable moving into spaces that already belonged to someone else. So when Diana arrived in this family in 1981 and the pattern started playing out again on a much larger and more devastating public stage, Anne already recognized it. She had seen it before the cameras ever started rolling on Charles and Diana's relationship. 3 decades later, Anne is the only senior royal in that building who holds both pieces at the same time. The institutional memory of everything that happened to this family publicly, and a personal motivation that comes from having been part of the story long before the public ever knew there was a story. Which brings us to a room that almost nobody has been discussing. Inside the Round Tower at Windsor Castle, there is a space called the Royal Archives. No public access, no documentary crews, no outside researchers without senior-level approval from the royal household itself. What is held inside those walls is the unfiltered written record of the British royal family across the entire 20th century. Private letters, personal diaries, internal memoranda, and correspondence from inside the household during the exact years when Charles and Diana's marriage was falling apart from the inside out. Princess Anne has access to those archives at a level very few living people possess. According to sources cited in royal reporting, she has been spending time in there. Not reviewing the broad public narrative that everyone already knows, the internal handling. Who knew what and when? Who facilitated the relationship between Charles and Camilla while Diana was raising 2 young children and watching her marriage disappear? How Diana's concerns were received inside the household, which aides were protecting which version of events, and at whose expense. People inside the palace have reportedly started referring to this process as the Windsor Reset. Whether that's an official designation or just shorthand among household staff, what it describes appears to be real and ongoing.
Anne is not writing a memoir. She is not calling a press conference. She is not briefing journalists. That is not how she has ever operated. What she appears to be doing is something considerably more durable. She is making sure that the official institutional version of events gets permanently reframed by the woman who has the keys to the room where the original documents are stored. If she finishes that work, Camilla's chapter in the history of this monarchy will not be shaped by Camilla's allies or by the sympathetic press coverage that followed the coronation. It will be shaped by Diana's sister-in-law. And that distinction inside an institution that takes its written record as seriously as this one does is not a small thing. Now, while Anne has been focused on the historical record, William has been working on something more immediate. The Duchy of Cornwall is not something most people think about when they are following royal news, but you need to understand what it actually is before any of this makes sense. This is not a ceremonial title or a symbolic designation. The duchy has existed since 1337. It was established by King Edward III to provide income for the heir to the throne. It spans over 130,000 acres across 23 counties in England, covering farmland, the Isles of Scilly, commercial property in central London, holiday cottages, tenant farms, and mineral rights. In the 2024 to 2025 financial year, the duchy generated a distributable surplus of £22.9 million. Every property decision, every staffing choice, every financial direction sits under William's direct control. When Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022, the duchy passed automatically from Charles to William the moment Charles became king. That transfer happened instantly, by law, with no negotiation and no transition period. And what William did next was described by people close to him as someone who plays an extraordinarily long game, patient, willing to wait years for the right conditions before making any visible move. And when you map the timeline of what William has actually done since September 2022, that description fits precisely.
In 2025, Charles signed paperwork extending the authority to grant royal warrants to both William and Catherine. Royal warrants are the formal endorsements the Crown gives to businesses and institutions, how the monarchy publicly signals approval and alignment. For centuries, monarchs have guarded that privilege as something distinctly their own. Extending it to William and Catherine while Charles is still alive and on the throne was a public statement about where the symbolic weight of the monarchy is being deliberately moved. It was not subtle to anyone watching from inside the palace. Then came the patronage redistribution. After Queen Elizabeth died in 2022, she held hundreds of royal patronages that needed to be reallocated across the working members of the family. Sources suggest that several high-profile patronages that had been quietly positioned for Camilla were redirected to other people. No announcement, no formal statement, just a list that did not carry her name in places where her name was apparently expected to appear. Then the wider Parker Bowles family access started narrowing. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, reportedly stopped receiving certain invitations he had previously expected. His proximity to specific Balmoral events reportedly ended quietly after the summer of 2024. Annabel Elliot, already removed from the duchy payroll by that point, also stopped appearing at several seasonal household functions she had attended consistently for nearly 2 decades. The wider social network Camilla had spent 20 years carefully building around herself started looking noticeably thinner at every gathering. And then the Sarah Ferguson situation added a genuinely complicated layer. Sarah's name appeared in the Epstein files released by the United States Justice Department. There is no evidence of criminal wrongdoing on her part, and that needs to be stated clearly. But the documented association is real, and Andrew's situation over the past several years has made every visible connection to that side of the family politically difficult for anyone trying to maintain credibility inside the institution. Sources say William's position to Camilla on this was direct. Distance yourself from Ferguson publicly and permanently, or accept the consequences of not doing so. Camilla reportedly refused. Ferguson is a friend who predates Camilla's entire royal life. Walking away from that friendship under external pressure feels to Camilla like being told who she is allowed to know. Whether that conversation happened precisely as it has been described to sources is impossible to confirm, but the standoff is reportedly real, ongoing, and costing Camilla influence inside the palace with every week it remains unresolved. What happened in early 2026 is the detail that made a significant number of people pay attention. Land registry records revealed that Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, Camilla's personal country retreat, had been quietly transferred out of her name. Let me be precise about what actually happened here, because this matters. This was not a straightforward sale on the open market. According to land registry documents, the property has been registered in the names of her son-in-law, Harry Lopes, and financier Jake Irwin,
understood to be acting on behalf of her children, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles. GB News confirmed that Lopes and Irwin hold the legal title for land registry purposes as trustees, but are not the beneficial owners. In plain terms, Camilla transferred Ray Mill into a family trust structure. She no longer holds it in her own name. Camilla bought Ray Mill in 1996 for £850,000, following her divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles. She lived there for 3 years after the divorce and has used it as her private retreat ever since. This is the house where she sought solitude after Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022. It served as the backdrop for her 75th birthday portraits, photographed by the Princess of Wales. Her daughter, Laura, held her wedding reception there in 2006. This is not a casual property. This is the address that belonged to Camilla the person, not Camilla the institution, and she has moved it out of her own name. Sources close to the situation say Camilla had been holding on to Ray Mill because she expected to need it later, not as a primary residence, but as the one address that would always be hers regardless of what happened inside Buckingham Palace. The place she could go if things changed around her in ways she could not control. Moving it into a trust structure at this moment tells a story of its own. Estate planning at the right time makes financial sense. Keeping assets in a clean structure before circumstances change is something any good financial advisor would recommend. But the timing, combined with everything else happening around her, is being read by sources close to the situation as evidence that Camilla has done the calculation on her actual position and is making decisions accordingly. And then there is the detail that sits right alongside this one. In March 2025, Charles purchased the property next door to Ray Mill, a 4-bedroom house called the Old Mill in Weybridge, Wiltshire, on a private lane that shares access with Ray Mill for £3.75 million through a company called Freezer Nominees Ltd, set up using Buckingham Palace as its correspondence address. The purchase was confirmed by land registry documents. The stated reason was reportedly to prevent the neighbouring property from being converted into a commercial venue. Charles buying the house next door, while Camilla transfers Ray Mill out of her personal name. Whatever the individual explanations are, those two things happening in close sequence tell you that the people most affected by what comes next are actively making plans. That financial calculation is worth spending a moment on because it explains a great deal. Right now, Camilla moves through Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, Sandringham and Balmoral as a matter of right. That is her current reality as Queen Consort. When Charles dies, 3 of those 4 properties pass directly to William. The realistic picture for Camilla in terms of what she personally inherits is Clarence House, estimated at approximately $72 million according to Forbes, and Highgrove, though Highgrove is more complicated than it sounds because Highgrove is technically owned by the Duchy of Cornwall and therefore by William, who has reportedly been charging Charles around £700,000 a year in rent for the property Charles has called home for decades. Which means that when Charles is gone, Camilla's position changes completely. She would go from Queen Consort to private widow, living at the discretion of a man who watched her break his mother across his entire childhood. Charles knows everything that is happening. That is the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to sit with, regardless of how you feel about anyone involved. He is 76 years old. He was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024 and has held his public duties together with real discipline across 2 difficult years. But discipline is not the same as energy, and fighting a sustained internal battle on Camilla's behalf would require considerably more than he currently has, especially when the British public still associates her instinctively with what happened to Diana. Sources say he made a phone call to Anne last February that lasted 40 minutes. It ended with nothing resolved. He reportedly told a senior aide that he understands what is happening. He does not blame William, he does not blame Anne, he simply has no answer for either of them. And that, more than anything else in this story, is what Camilla cannot find a way around, because as long as Charles cannot or will not intervene, there is no counterweight inside that building. There is is no one with the standing and the motivation to push back on William and Anne simultaneously. Camilla is navigating this essentially alone. What that looks like from the inside, according to sources, is someone watching her own position get methodically taken apart. Not in one dramatic confrontation, not in any single visible moment she can point to and contest. In 100 quiet decisions, each one individually deniable, each one explicable on its own terms, but collectively forming a pattern she can see clearly and cannot address directly. She has reportedly raised the patronage redistribution privately with senior aides. She has asked why certain invitations stopped arriving. She has asked about specific decisions that affected her family's access. The answers she receives back are procedural and formal. There is no argument to be had because nobody has formally declared anything. There is only a pattern she recognizes and cannot name out loud without sounding paranoid to people who are not watching as closely as she is. You cannot litigate a pattern. You cannot file a complaint about a feeling. You cannot demand a meeting with someone whose entire approach depends on never saying the thing directly. William has not made a single public statement against Camilla. He has not given an interview. He has not briefed against her on the record. His decisions have been communicating his position with quiet, consistent, methodical clarity for 3 years. And the institution around him has simply followed his lead the way institutions always do when the future king signals a direction and holds it without wavering. Let me bring this back to William for a moment, because I think the personal dimension here is genuinely underestimated. There is a photograph from September 1997 that most people have seen. 2 boys walking behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London. William was 15, Harry was 12. The streets were silent except for the sound of hooves on stone. William has never publicly described what that walk felt like. He has spoken about it privately, according to people who know him well, in short sentences across many years. What he reportedly said to one close friend was that the hardest part was not the coffin. The hardest part was knowing that the woman who had hurt his mother the most was still alive, still close to his father, and still on her way to taking his mother's place inside the family. That conversation reportedly happened in 1998. He was 16 years old. There is another moment from a few years before that, when William was around 13, that a former household member described later. He reportedly asked a tutor what the word adultery meant. He had seen it in a newspaper headline. The tutor did not answer him. Whether that specific exchange happened exactly as it was described is impossible to know, but it sounds completely consistent with what that child was surrounded by at the time. His parents' marriage disintegrating in public. His mother's pain being documented in real time across every newspaper in the country. The name of the woman involved appearing on front pages he was old enough to read and old enough to understand. That child is now 43 years old. He controls the most valuable royal estate in Britain. He decides who works for it and who does not. He decides which patronages go where. He decides who gets invited to Balmoral and who stops receiving those invitations. And he has never once in 25 years given any public indication that he has let go of what he watched his mother go through. The uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this is that Camilla did win by every conventional measurement. She got the marriage, she got the title, she got the coronation. She stood in Westminster Abbey in May 2023 with the late Queen's tiara on her head and the cameras of the entire world pointed at her. By the standards of how these situations are usually resolved, the rehabilitation was complete.
But the war was never about Charles. It was always about Diana. And you cannot win a war about Diana's legacy when Diana's son controls the money, Diana's sister-in-law controls the archives, and Diana's memory still commands more emotional loyalty from the British public than almost anything the current institution produces. Camilla won the battle that was visible. She is losing the one that was never announced. Anne, when a senior household figure reportedly asked whether the timing of all of this was harsh, answered in 5 words. Diana deserves the truth now. Whether those exact words were said precisely as reported, or whether that is staff shorthand for something more complicated, the meaning is consistent with everything that has followed. Anne is not protecting Camilla. She never was. And in this family, when Anne withdraws her protection from someone, every other person in that building reads the signal immediately and adjusts accordingly. Diana never got to see what came after. She got a tunnel in Paris, 2 boys without a mother, and a family that debated for 4 days whether to lower its flags. She did not get to see how this chapter would be written. But what appears to be happening inside that palace right now is something she never lived to witness. Her son and her sister-in-law moving together quietly and permanently, reshaping everything Camilla spent 30 years building. Not through confrontation, not through public statements, but through patience and access and the slow institutional weight of people who have decided what the official version of this story is going to say. Camilla took the marriage, Diana keeps the legacy, and right now inside Buckingham Palace, those 2 facts are not sitting comfortably alongside each other anymore. The question everyone inside that institution is currently avoiding out loud is a simple one. What happens when Charles is gone? While Charles is on the throne, Camilla's position carries the formal weight of the monarchy behind it. She travels on state visits. She sits at the formal dinners. She represents the crown. That is her reality today. But the moment that changes, most of the formal protection she currently holds disappear. The person who would control most of the decisions that affect her daily life would be William, and the person shaping how history records her chapter would be Anne. Sources suggest Camilla understands this. The Ray Mill transfer is being read by people close to the situation as evidence that she has stopped planning for a version of the future that keeps her position centrally inside the institution. She is planning, instead, for a version that gives her and her children a clear family asset structure outside of it. That is a significant shift, and it happened quietly in Wiltshire, with no announcement and no explanation. The British public's relationship with Camilla has always been complicated, and it's worth being honest about that complexity rather than glossing over it. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005, the polls were not kind. A significant portion of the public never fully separated her from what happened to Diana. The rehabilitation effort that followed was real and sustained. There were years of careful public appearances, charitable work, warm press coverage, and a gradual softening of the image. By the time of the coronation in 2023, the open hostility had largely quieted. But the public memory of Diana does not follow the same arc as institutional acceptance. The people who watched Diana's Panorama interview in 1995, who stood on the streets of London in 1997 and watched the cortege pass, who left flowers outside Kensington Palace, did not simply update their feelings because the palace decided the rehabilitation was complete. William knows this, Anne knows this, and their approach inside the institution reflects an understanding that the public's emotional relationship with Diana is not a factor they need to overcome, it is a factor already working in their direction.
This is where the story stands right now. Camilla is queen consort, Charles is king. The formal structure of the monarchy is intact and visible on every official occasion. Nothing has been announced, nothing has been publicly declared. But underneath that presentation, the picture is considerably different. Anne is reportedly in the archives. William controls the duchy and the household machinery. The Parker Bowles family's access to the inner circle has narrowed. The patronages have shifted. The invitation lists have changed. And Ray Mill House, the property Camilla owned before any of this began, is no longer registered in her name, while Charles has quietly bought the house next door. He reportedly has no answer for William. He reportedly has no answer for Anne. And that absence of an answer from the one person in that building with the standing to change the direction of any of this is the space that everything else is moving through. Diana never got to write the ending of her own story. It was written for her and then rewritten again by the people who survived her, and then by the biographers and the documentaries and the decades of coverage that followed. What appears to be happening now inside Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace and the Duchy of Cornwall offices is that the people who loved her most have decided they would like a say in how the official version reads, not through the press, not through interviews, through the institutional record, through the archives, through the slow, patient, entirely deliberate work of people who have the access, the motivation, and by every visible indication, the time. Camilla took the marriage. Charles gave her that, and it was real, and it lasted, and she stood in Westminster Abbey with the late Queen's tiara on her head and the world watching. That part of the story belongs to her. But the legacy, the way this chapter gets recorded and remembered, that is a different competition entirely. And right now, the people holding the most important cards in that competition are not Camilla's allies. They never really were. That is the full picture as we understand it today. We will keep reporting what we can verify, and we will keep being straight with you about the difference between what is confirmed, what is sourced, and what is interpretation. That is what this channel has always tried to do. If this is a story you want to stay across as it develops, the subscribe button is there and the notification bell keeps you in the conversation. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Camilla is being treated fairly? Or do you think William and Anne are simply doing what Diana never had anyone to do for her? This audience always has something worth saying, and we read far more of it than you probably think.